But Hel had never asked for the dead. She had not asked for the hall, or for the high walls, or for the long road that brought them down to her 9 nights at a time. She'd been a child when the sentence was passed. Her father was Loki. Her mother was a giantess out of the ironwood, had been born with one side of her a living girl and the other side blue-black, like a body 3 days under the ground. For that, and for nothing she had yet done, Odin carried her down himself past the roots of the world. He gave her a country that no one else wanted. He told her it was hers. Then he rode back up and left her standing in it. She kept it. She kept it without complaint, and she kept it more exactly than any god ever kept anything. The country he had given her lay north of everything and downward at the bottom of the world. That country was called Niflheim, which meant the home of mist. It lay along the northern edge of Ginnunga Gap, the yawning gap, an emptiness so wide that nothing inside it had a name. 11 rivers rose there out of a single spring and ran outward into the dark. They froze as they ran. Layer settled over layer until the rime stood up in walls, and the walls went on growing in the cold. To the south lay Muspelheim, a country of fire that no living thing had ever crossed. Sparks lifted off it and drifted out over the gap like ash off a hearth. Where the sparks came down on the ice softened and water ran, and in the water there was life. Everything that ever breathed afterwards came out of that meeting of frost and fire. The frost had been there first. Out of the middle of the worlds there grew a tree. Its name was Yggdrasil, and its branches held up the sky the way rafters held up a roof. An eagle sat at the crown of it. Dew fell from its leaves and gathered in the valleys underneath. The tree stood on 3 roots, and each root went down into a different country. One root reached over Asgard, where the gods kept their high halls and their gold. One reached over the land of the frost giants. A well lay under the stone there, and a severed head kept watch beside it. But the third route went down into Niflheim, into the cold that had been there before anything else, and beneath that third route the ground kept going. A road ran there. It went downward, and it went northward, and it went a very long way. The living did not walk it. Everything else walked it in its own time, and the road never hurried any of them. That road would carry a great deal before the worlds were finished. A god would ride down it 9 nights on an 8-legged horse to bargain for the life of his son, and the woman who answered him never once raised her voice. A queen would set her price for that son, and the price was one small thing, and it was never paid. And at the last of all the tellings, a ship built out of the untrimmed nails of dead men lifted off its moorings on a rising flood. It sailed out of that dark with a crew of everyone the road had ever taken. But she had not been born in that country, and she had not been born a queen. She had been born a long way east of it, in the days before the gods had any reason to know her name. Part 1. Angrboda's daughter, east of Midgard. Past the last fenced field and the last barking dog, there stood a wood of iron. Men called it the Ironwood, and those who kept sheep did not go near it. The trees in it were black and cold to the hand, and their leaves rang faintly whenever the wind moved through them. Troll wives had lived beneath those trees for longer than the farms above had stood. They bore sons in the shape of wolves, and one of those sons would one day take the moon out of the sky. Loki went into that wood far more often than the gods ever knew. He would be gone from Asgard a whole season at a stretch. When he came back, he told nobody where he had been. The greatest of the troll wives was called Angrboda, and her name meant the one who brings grief. She kept a long house under the iron trees, roofed with turf that had gone grey with frost. The timbers were dark with old smoke, and the smoke never entirely left the room. A fire burned in a stone-lined pit down the middle of the floor. Its light reached about as far as a strong man could throw a stone. Past that the hall went on into shadow. That shadow was full of things she had gathered over a very long life. Bones stood stacked along one wall in bundles, tied with cord and sorted by size the way firewood was sorted. Hides were pegged out flat to dry, and they still carried the smell of the animals they had come off. Wool hung down from the crossbeams in unspun handfuls, grey and brown and black. It stirred whenever the door was opened along the far wall. She kept iron because iron was what that wood gave her. There were broken blades there, and bent nails, and a helmet with the cheek pieces torn away, and a chain that nobody ever asked about. Salt lay in a wooden box near the hearth, dry and coarse and grey. A bucket of water stood by the door with a skin of ice across it most mornings. An upright loom leaned against the gable end, warp-weighted with river stones. A piece of grey cloth had been growing on it for years without ever being taken down. The smell of the place was smoke first, then wet wool, then salt. Under all of it, there was something faintly like a smithy after the fire had been let out. But the floor was beaten earth, hard from long use, and it was swept. That was the thing a visitor noticed last and remembered longest. The house of the grief-bringer was tidy. She ground her grain in the morning and she banked her fire at night. She kept a pot hanging over the coals, the way pots were kept on every farm in the north. Outside her door the iron trees stood in their ranks with no birds in them at all. The quiet under those trees was the deepest quiet anywhere in the 9 worlds. It was not an unfriendly quiet, it was simply very old, and it had never been interrupted by anything that mattered. Loki came there in the winters, when Asgard was full of long feasts and nobody counted heads at the table. He would set his boots by the fire and let the ice melt out of them into the ash. Then he would talk half the night sometimes, and Angrboda listened a good deal more than she answered. She had been in the ironwood since before the gods raised their walls. She had watched a great deal arrive and a great deal go, and she was in no hurry about any of it. What she felt for him was not quite love. It was steady, though, and in that wood steadiness counted for a good deal more. But in time, Angrboda bore children to Loki, and they were not children as Asgard understood the word. The first came out a wolf, grey and wet and already hungry, and they named him Fenrir. He was the size of a hound within the month, and the size of a horse within the year. The second came out a serpent, and they called him Jormungandr, which meant the great beast of the earth. He was thin as a rope at the start, and he never stopped growing after that. The third was a daughter, and she was the strangest of the 3, and by far the quietest, from the crown of her head down to her hip. She was a living girl. She was warm, with colour in her cheeks and breath in her mouth. Below the hip she was blue-black and cold, the flesh of a body 3 days dead. It did not warm when she stood at the fire. Angrboda washed her and wrapped her in wool and gave her a name. They called her HEL. The name meant only the hidden one, the covered over, the thing that was laid in the ground and left there. Word of the 3 came up out of the ironwood the way bad news always travelled slowly and then all at once. Odin heard it in Asgard and went to ask what the children were for. The answers he was given were not comfortable ones. He was told that the wolf would kill him at the ending of the world. He was told that the serpent and Thor would finish one another on the last day. About the girl he was told very little, and the little was worse for being small. She would take the dead, and she would keep them, and not one of them ever came back up the road. So Odin sent for all three, and they were brought up out of the wood together. He looked at them a long while before he did anything at all. The serpent he took up and threw into the deep sea that lay around Midgard. Down there Jormungandr grew as he had grown in the ironwood, only faster. His body reached around the whole ring of the world. When there was nowhere further for him to go, he closed his jaws on his own tail and held it. He lay like that beneath the water for an age. The tide moved when he moved, and the sailors above him called it weather. The wolf Odin kept close instead, inside the walls, on the theory that a thing watched was a thing controlled. Fenrir grew, and the gods grew afraid of him, and only Tyr had the nerve to carry him his meat. Twice they bound him with iron chains, twice he broke them like thread, and stood shaking the pieces off his shoulders. The third binding was a ribbon called Gleipnir, soft as silk and light in the hand. The dwarfs had woven it out of things that did not exist. The noise a cat made walking, the beard of a woman, and the roots of a mountain that nobody had ever dug up to look at. The wolf smelled the trick in it, and would not be bound unless a god laid a hand in his mouth as a pledge. Laid his hand in. When the ribbon held, the wolf shut his jaws through the wrist. Walked away, one hand lighter, and not one of the gods laughed. But the third child Odin did not kill, and he did not bind her either. He had her lifted up and set in front of him on Sleipnir, his 8-legged horse. Then he rode out through the gate himself and told nobody where he was going. They went down. The road passed under the roots of the world and turned north. The light behind them thinned and then stopped being light at all. The girl did not cry. She sat with both hands wound into the horse's mane. She watched the country change from stone to frost to nothing. She said not one word the whole way down. At the bottom he lifted her off and set her on her feet in Niflheim. The frost took the print of her shoes. "This is yours," he said. 9 worlds, and everything in them that dies of sickness and of old age. Everyone who dies in a bed will be sent down this road to you. You will give them lodging, and you will give them board, and you will not turn a single one of them away. "And who sends them?" She said. "I do," Odin replied. "How long am I to keep them?" "Until the world ends," he said. She looked past him into the dark, which went on further than looking could follow. Then she looked back at the old man on the horse, and she took her time about it. "Then I will need a house," she said. Odin gave her nothing to that. He turned Sleipnir and rode back up the way he had come. He did not look behind him, because there was nothing behind him that he wanted to see. He had been careful with her, and he would say so in Asgard. He had not spilled her blood, and he had not bound her limbs. There were gods at home who called the whole arrangement merciful, but he had set a child down at the bottom of the coldest country there was, and handed her a duty with no ending in it. He understood that as well as anyone did. He rode home all the same. What the girl understood, standing on the frost with the sound of the hooves going away above her, was a good deal simpler. She had been given a kingdom, and the kingdom was also a sentence, and the two of them would never come apart again. Somewhere far above her, at the head of the road, a gate that had always stood there closed itself without a hand on it. After that there was no sound at all in the whole country. She turned and began to walk downward, because downward was the only direction the road offered. Frost formed as she went on the living half of her face, in her eyebrows and along her jaw. She did not once brush it away. Part 2, Eljudnir. She walked down for a long time. Some said it took her 9 days. Others told it differently and said 9 years at the bottom. The difference did not amount to much. The road went on ahead of her, and the frost went on under her feet. Behind her, the way she had come closed up into dark, and she stopped turning round to look at it. There was nothing to eat on that road, and she did not need anything. When the ground at last levelled out, she stood still and looked at what she had been given. What she had been given was nothing at all. There was a plain of grey frost, and a mist standing on it, and somewhere out of sight the sound of a river. Nothing had ever been built there, so she raised walls first, because a house without walls around it was only a shed in a field. They went up higher than any walls raised anywhere in the 9 worlds. A woman standing at their foot could not make out the top of them. There was no light up there to see by, in any case. There was stone at the base and iron above. The iron sweated in the cold and left long rust-coloured streaks down the grey. She hung gates in them to match, and the gates were enormous, and they were hung to swing inward. But nothing in the way they were made allowed them to open the other way. That would matter one day, though not for a very long time, and not to anyone then living. Inside the walls she built her hall, and she gave it a name. She called it Eljudnir, which meant the one sprayed with sleet. Some told it as the sleet damp, and some as the rain beaten. All of the tellings agreed on the important part, which was the weather. The roof was steep and it was always wet. Sleet came in through the smoke hole in a thin slant and fell on the floor in the middle of the room. It never quite stopped, and after the first 100 years nobody remarked on it. There was a fire pit down the length of the hall and a fire in it. The fire gave a low light that reached the walls on either side. It gave no warmth whatsoever. The wood in it burned without ever going down to ash. It would burn exactly like that until the world ended. Benches ran along both walls, strewn with straw, and the straw was fresh. At the far end there was a high seat with 2 carved posts. She sat in it, and she was not large, and the seat had been made to fit her. She would keep that seat longer than any king above would keep his. Then she named the things in the house one at a time, and she took her time over it, because she had a great deal of time. At the door she set a flat stone that stood a little proud of the floorboards, just high enough to catch the front of a shoe. She called it Falanda Forad, which meant the falling peril, the pitfall, the stumbling block. Everyone who ever crossed into that hall caught a foot on it and went forward a half step onto their hands. Everyone did it exactly once, and nobody was ever hurt by it. But it was not cruelty. It was the first lesson of the house, given at the door, which was that there was no dignified way in. On the long table she laid a dish. It was shallow and hammered out of iron. It was worn bright in the middle, from use it had not had yet. Whatever was put on that dish came off it again unsatisfying, and she called the dish Hungra, which meant hunger. Every guest who ever ate from it would rise from the table, still hungry. Beside it she laid a knife with a thin blade. It had been ground down over years that had not happened, the way a good knife was worn away by the whetstone. It cut whatever was set in front of it, and it cut cleanly. What it could not do was make any of it enough. She called the knife Salter, which meant famine, behind the hall. She made a sleeping room, and in it she set a bed. It was a good bed by any standard, wide and low. The frame was dark wood, and the mattress was straw, under a covering of grey wool. Anyone who lay down in it would settle the way the sick settled. They lay flat on their backs, with their hands folded on their chests and their heels together. She called the bed Kor, which meant the sick bed. Around the bed she hung curtains. They were the one beautiful thing in the whole house. They were pale, and they caught what little light there was and gave it back faintly. The bed stood inside a soft glimmer, even in the deepest part of the dark. Anyone lying there would look up at them and think, for a moment, that something good had happened. She called those hangings Blick yonder ball, which meant the gleaming bale, the shining misfortune, the pretty thing that was the beginning of trouble. 2 servants kept the house with her. The man was called Ganglati and the woman was called Ganglot, and both names meant the same thing, which was slow walker. Where they had come from, nobody ever said. They crossed a room very slowly. A watcher could stare at them for the length of a long breath and remain unsure whether they had moved at all. Ganglati would set out from the door with a jug and arrive at the table in his own good time. The jug never spilled. Nothing was ever late, because nothing in that house had an hour to be late for. Slowness was the law there, as fire was law in Muspelheim, and frost was the law above. Everything in Eljudnir was done properly, and nothing in it was done quickly. But the hall had been built for guests, and for a long while no guest came. She kept it ready all the same. The straw on the benches was turned, the dish was set out, and the knife was laid beside it. The curtains were drawn back in the morning and drawn across at night, though there was no morning and no night to speak of. She ate alone at the head of her own table, with the 2 slow servants standing behind her. There were seasons in that place, of a sort, and she counted them, and she stopped counting them. She would be ready whenever they came, and she had no doubt at all that they would come. Then, on a day no different from the days on either side of it, something struck the gate. Ganglati went to it. He crossed the whole floor of the hall, and then the yard beyond the hall. It took him what would have been half a day up in the world of the living. He drew the bar, and the gates came inward. Outside them, on the frost, an old woman stood waiting with her hands folded in front of her. She had lived 73 winters up in Midgard. She had buried a husband and 4 of her 7 children. She had died in her own bed at the end of a long sickness, with a daughter holding one hand and a granddaughter holding the other. Her hair had been combed for the grave, and it was still neat. She looked up at the walls and then further up, and could not find the top of them. "Is this the whole of it?" the old woman said. "This is the whole of it," Hel replied. The old woman came in over the threshold and caught her foot on the stone and went down onto her hands. Ganglot helped her up without hurrying about it, and neither of them said anything about it afterwards. She was brought to the table and seated on the bench. The queen of that place sat down at the head of it, half warm and half blue-black, and looked at her guest with something close to courtesy. "My husband went under the sea 11 years ago," the old woman said. "Is he in this house?" "No," Hel replied. "The sea keeps its own, and it does not send them to me." Ganglot brought the dish called Hunger and set it down, and the knife called Famine was laid beside it. The old woman was served, and she ate the food went into her, and she was no less hungry at the end of it than she had been at the start. But she did not complain. She had eaten thin winters before, 3 of them very bad. She had a countrywoman's sense of what could be argued with and what could not. She finished what was in front of her and folded her hands again on the edge of the table. What the Queen felt, watching the first of her guests eat, the first meal ever served in that hall, was not triumph and was nothing like pleasure. It was the plain relief of a builder who had seen a roof take rain and hold. The house worked, the dish did what it had been made to do, and the knife did what it had been made to do. The woman was fed and was not filled. None of that had needed one word of cruelty from anybody. Afterwards, the old woman was shown to the bed. The pale hangings were drawn back, and they shone a little in the dark as she lay down. She looked up at them for a while before she closed her eyes. After that they came steadily. They came 1 and 2 at a time at first, and then in strings and crowds. The hall took all of them and had room. Sentries went by outside, and the benches filled from the door end backwards, 1 bed at a time. There were guests in that house who had been sitting quietly for longer than some of the kingdoms above had stood. And at the head of the table, every day of all of it, the Queen ate from her own dish with her own knife. She rose from that table not once fully fed. Above her, out in the frost, beyond the walls, the long road went on, delivering them down. Part 3. The road down, none of the guests seated in that hall had come to it directly from their own deathbeds. Between the last breath and the bench in Eljudnir lay a road. Everyone who had ever eaten from the dish called hunger had first walked that road. They walked it alone, in the dark, for 9 full nights. The road began with the living. It was the living who would make the dead ready to travel it. They called it the HEL, which meant the road to hell. No one who loved the dead sent them onto it barefoot. A pair of shoes was bound to a corpse's feet before it went into the ground. They were thick-soled and laced tight at the ankle. These were spoken of as hell shoes. Whoever wore them would not have to walk so long a road with nothing between the soles of their feet and the stone. An old woman might spend the evening before a husband's burial stitching a pair by firelight. A needle was too fine for fingers already stiff with grief. A soul that set out unshod would arrive at the gate with its feet cut to ribbons. No one wanted to picture a father or a daughter making that walk. The pain of it could have been spared by a single evening's sewing. The custom held whether the dead had been rich or poor. A chieftain was buried with a sword across his knees. A herdsman was buried in the clothes he had died in. The road did not care what a soul had owned above it. It cared only whether that soul's feet were covered. The road itself offered little to look at, and that was a mercy of a kind. 9 nights of valleys followed one after another. Each was deeper and darker than the one before. A soul newly loosed from its body could no longer have said whether its eyes were open or closed. There was no moon over that country, and there had never been a sun. The ground changed without warning underfoot. It went from packed earth to loose scree to something colder that might have been ice. A traveller learned to trust the road only through the soles of his shoes. Some living hand had bound them on before the burial. Cold rose out of the stone itself rather than falling from any sky. It thickened with every valley. By the 5th or 6th night, even the memory of warmth had grown thin and hard to hold on to. The soul had carried grief or fear or a stubborn kind of relief out of its old life. It went on carrying all of it down that road. Nothing in the dark took the weight from anyone's hands. A soul might walk the whole 9 nights and meet no one. It might hear nothing and see nothing but the next valley opening ahead of the last. That emptiness would do more to prepare a traveller for Hell's Hall than any amount of company could have done. But the road was not walked at the same pace by every kind of dead. The very old had spent years already growing used to a body that failed them by degrees. They often walked it steadily, without hurry, the way they had learned to cross an icy yard at 70. Children walked it holding nothing, because nothing had been bound into their small hands to carry. It was said, though never by anyone who could prove it, that the road was gentler with them than with anyone else who travelled it. Somewhere within that unbroken procession of valleys a sound began. Some of the newly dead half recognized it. It was faint at first, the same low murmur that carried over the frost plain around Eljudnir itself on quiet nights. No one inside those walls had ever put a name to it. Out on the road it grew instead of fading. It thickened from a murmur into a rumble, and then into something closer to a roar. The 9th night's valley opened at last onto black water, moving fast between stone banks. This was the river Gjujol, whose name meant the loud one. It had earned that name honestly. Nothing else on the whole 9-night road made a sound at all. The water of Gjul ran heavy with iron, weapons rode its current the way driftwood might have ridden any river in the world above. Blades gone dark went past, and axe heads and broken spear points. It was the accumulated wreckage of every death dealt by an edge since the road was first walked. All of it turned slowly downstream toward some final resting place none of the dead ever saw. A traveller who watched long enough would eventually stop counting the blades. He would accept the water as another feature of the landscape. By the 9th night it seemed no stranger than the valleys had already made everything else seem. A soul standing on the bank for the first time might have watched a blade tumble past. It might have recognized with a small cold shock the very weapon that had opened its own last wound. But the river carried the tools of their deaths and not the hands that had wielded them. Unaware of that, some of the newly dead stood a long while at the water's edge. They watched iron pass that had once been close to them in ways they were only beginning to understand were over the river stood a bridge called Galabru, which meant the ringing bridge. It was roofed against a sky that never once produced rain. Along that roof lay a thatching of shining gold. Whoever built it had wanted one bright thing on the whole dark road. The bridge rang when it was crossed. It rang loud and clear under the boots of the living, a sound like a bell struck once for every footfall. But it lay entirely silent under the feet of the dead. They crossed it in a long, unbroken procession and made no more noise doing so than smoke made crossing a room. No one living had built that gold thatching within memory. No one dead could say who had. They knew only that it had always been there dull under the black sky, and yet somehow still catching what little light the road allowed. But the bridge was not left unwatched. A maiden stood at the near end of Galabru, and let no one across without a word. Her name was Modgud, a name that carried something of battle fury inside it. Nothing in her bearing that day suggested violence of any kind. She simply would not be walked past. She had held that post since the bridge was first laid across the river. She would go on holding it long after every soul presently crossing had been forgotten by the world above. She asked each traveller the same 3 things. She asked for a name, a kinsman's name, and the manner of the death that had put them on the road. It was said she could tell the colour of the living from the colour of the dead at a single glance. She weighed each one by ear as much as by eye, because dead feet made no sound at all on the gold-thatched planks. One crossing was remembered afterwards and retold among the dead still waiting their turn behind him. An old smith named Thorvald came to the bridge. His hands were still faintly marked by decades at the forge. Modgud stopped him at the planks. She asked her 3 questions in the order she always asked them. "Thorvald," he said, "son of Bjorn, I died of a fever in my own bed 3 nights past midwinter." Modgud studied him a moment before she replied. "You have the colour of a dead man," she said, "but your feet fall heavier than most who cross here. What did you carry through your life that still weighs on you now?" Thorvald considered the question longer than he expected to need. "A debt," he replied at last, "owed to a man I never repaid before either of us died." "It will not follow you past this water," Modgud said. "Nothing owed above follows anyone below." She stepped aside. The bridge made no sound under his HEL shoes. It stayed silent under him, as it always did for the dead, for the whole of the crossing. What he felt, setting his first foot onto the far bank, was not the ease he had expected to feel. It was something closer to the emptiness of a man discovering that a burden had never needed carrying at all. He had carried it out of stubborn habit. It would not have followed him regardless of whether he had confessed it or kept silent. Beyond the bridge the road narrowed and dropped again. It ran toward a cave mouth called Nipperhelia, which meant the overhang. There the whole path was forced to pass within reach of a hound chained just inside it. This was Garmr, a name some said meant nothing grander than the Howler. His chest and jaw were wet with blood that never dried. The blood was explained to no one who passed him. He strained against his chain at every soul that came near. He howled once, low and long, and subsided again once they had gone by. The dead had never been his to take, but the howl carried a long way down that narrow stretch of road. Few of the newly dead passed the cave without quickening their step. Whatever lifetime of dying, slowly, had already taught their bodies about fear. 3 times Thorvald heard that howl behind him before the sound finally fell away into the dark. He heard it once close, once further, and once so faint it might have belonged to some other traveller's crossing entirely. Beyond the hound stood the gate itself, iron-bound and taller than any wall he had stood beneath while living. Beyond the gate, at last, stood the shape of Eljudnir's roof-line and the smell of a hall that was kept warm. A long, quiet line of those who had crossed before him was already filing forward toward whichever bench had newly opened. They went unhurried, and none of them was speaking. All of them were dressed for whatever weather had killed them, wool and linen, and in one case a soldier's mail worn thin at the shoulders from a death that had nothing to do with any battle at all. Thorvald took his place at the end of that line without complaint. The debt he had confessed on the bridge was already a smaller thing in his mind than it had been an hour before. It was small enough that he would forget, by the time he reached the table, that it had ever felt heavy at all. But the line moved forward at its own pace, regardless of what any single traveller in it was feeling. One bench opened for every one that had newly filled. It would go on moving that way long after Thorvald himself had become just another quiet figure near the front of it. Ahead of him the gate stood open, swinging inward as it always swung. Beyond it the long table waited under its pale hangings, with room enough, as it always somehow proved to have, for one more. Part 4. The sorting of the dead. Thorvald's crossing was one among thousands. But the road that carried him to Eljudnir carried only a portion of the dead. The 9 worlds produced far more of them in any given year. Long before Thorvald's own birth, it had already been decided by powers with no interest in a smith's opinion on the matter. A man who died with a weapon still warm in his hand belonged to a different accounting altogether. So did anyone the sea chose to keep for itself? So in a smaller and quieter way did the old farmer. He asked to be laid under the very hill he had worked his whole life, rather than sent walking anywhere at all. Warriors who fell in battle went, half of them, to a hall built for exactly that purpose. No other hall in the 9 worlds was ever described at such length by the poets who sang of it. Valhalla, the hall of the slain, stood roofed entirely in overlapping shields. They were gold-rimmed and turned outward like the scales of some vast sleeping creature. Its rafters were spears laid edge to edge instead of timber. Chainmail was said to be heaped along its benches the way wool might be heaped along the benches of any ordinary farmhouse. The light inside came not from any hearth but from the blades themselves. Their edges were bright enough to read a face by 540 doors opened along its walls. Each one was wide enough for 800 warriors to walk through shoulder to shoulder. On the day the wolf finally broke his chain, every one of those doors would open at once, and not before. Inside, long tables ran the length of the hall under a haze of wood smoke and roasting fat. A boar named Hermod, the sooty one, was killed and boiled there every single evening. He rose again each morning whole and ready to be killed once more. The supply of meat never once ran short, no matter how many centuries of dead men sat down to eat it. A goat named Hydron stood on the roof and cropped the leaves of a tree growing up through the hall. Her name carried a trace of brightness in it. From her udder came mead instead of milk. It was enough to fill the horn of every warrior at every table without the cask ever running dry. 2 ravens were said to perch near the high seat, and an eagle somewhere higher still. But the hall's true occupants had eyes only for the yard beyond its doors. They were called the Einherjar, the chosen again. Each of them had died fighting rather than fading, and so each of them had fought alone. They spent their mornings killing one another in that yard, wound for wound. Iron rang on iron until the ground underfoot ran wet. The air smelled of nothing but blood and cold metal. By midday the wounds closed as though they had never been opened. The dead rose from the mud one by one. They found their own severed limbs or did not need to. Then they walked back inside to wash before the evening's meat and mead. Young warrior, newly arrived from some battlefield in the world above, might spend his first morning in that yard. He was genuinely afraid of dying twice, but he understood, the way every one of them eventually did, that the hall had already taken the only death that could be taken from him. It was, by every account that survived, a violent kind of paradise. It had been built for men who had never much wanted a quiet one. But Odin never took the whole battlefield harvest for himself. Frigga, whose name meant simply lady, chose first among the slain. She did so by right and by old agreement between them. She took half of every day's dead to her own hall before Odin's chosen riders came for the rest. Her hall stood in a district called Folkvanga, which meant the field of the host. The hall itself was named Sesrumnir, the roomy seated. It had been built with benches enough that no one who died bravely and was claimed by her ever had to stand. Less was ever said of what happened inside Sessrumnir than of what happened inside Valhalla. What little survived suggested it was gentler there, though no less full. Some said women were welcomed there too. They were wives and daughters who had died with a courage judged equal to any warrior's. Others told it differently. No single telling of Sessrumnir was ever quite the same as the last. No sword was required to be excluded from either hall. Water alone was enough. Hel had said as much herself once, plainly, to an old woman asking after a husband drowned 11 winters past. The sea keeps its own, and it does not send them to me. It was the truest sentence anyone in any of the 9 worlds could have offered about where the sea's dead actually went. They went to Ran. Ran kept a net vast enough to draw a whole ship under at once. She used it without much interest in whether the sailors caught in it had lived good lives or bad ones. Her name meant something close to plunder or robbery. She came by it honestly. What she took she kept without asking and without returning. No amount of gold sewn into a collar would buy back a life already claimed, unaware of that. Sailors kept weighting their clothes with rings before every voyage regardless. They hoped the gift might at least buy a warmer welcome once they arrived. The custom worked, by every telling, exactly as often as it failed. But it persisted for exactly as long as men kept drowning. On the floor of the sea she kept a hall of her own. It was lit by nothing that should have been able to burn underwater and yet somehow did. The light was gold mostly, all of it carried down by hands that had once worn it. The hall itself was built the way any hall on land was built, of timber and turf and thatch. Everything in it moved a little with the current. It moved the way a field of barley moved in a wind that never quite stopped. Fish passed through its open doorways the way birds might have passed through the doorway of a farmhouse left open in summer. Drowned men were said to wake at a long table there, salt-soaked and blinking. Weed was tangled in hair that had not stopped growing. They were given ale by hands they did not recognize. One such telling had a fisherman waking at that table across from a face he did recognize. It belonged to a cousin drowned 11 years before him in the very same strait. "You took your time," the cousin said. "I did not choose the hour," the fisherman replied. "No one does," here the cousin said, and pushed a full horn of ale across the table toward him. "Drink. She pours once and she does not pour twice, so make the one cup last as long as it needs to." What the fisherman felt, taking that horn in both hands, was not fear so much as relief. It was the strange, seasick relief of a man who had spent his whole working life afraid of exactly this water. He had finally stopped falling. Not everyone who died went anywhere at all in the sense of a road or a hall or a net. In farming country especially, it was long believed that the dead might simply go into the hill nearest their own door. The mound they were buried under stood in for any longer journey. They stayed there among their own grave goods. They watched their own fields from the inside of the earth. A man might live his whole life looking at the very hill he expected to enter at the end of it. He worked the same slope every summer and herded sheep across the same green shoulder of ground. In time the hill stopped being scenery and became something closer to an appointment. He would be buried inside it with his own tools, his own weapons, his own drinking horn. Whatever life continued in there would not be a poorer one than the life he had already lived above it. Some households kept a kind of half-belief that their oldest dead was still in there, still nearby, still owed a measure of respect. The living passed close by the mound after dark. They carried a lit torch a little higher than it strictly needed to be. They murmured a greeting out of old habit, more than fear. Of all these portions, sea, sword, mound and hall, Hel's remained by far the largest. It was neither a punishment nor a reward. It was simple arithmetic. Most people in every age the 9 worlds had seen did not die at sea, and did not die with a weapon in hand. They died old, or they died young of a sickness no one had a name for, or they died small in a bed under a roof they had built or inherited. Kin surrounded them who would remember the exact weather on the day it happened. That was the straw death, so called because it happened in a bed of straw rather than on any field. It was by a very wide margin how most of humanity actually left the world. A king would die of it as readily as a beggar. A warrior who had survived 40 battles would die of it in his own bed at 80, undone at last by nothing sharper than age. Every one of them would find the same table waiting, the same dish, the same slow-walking servants, unhurried by rank or reputation. But Hel's hall was built for that majority, not for the exceptional dead the poets preferred to sing about. Its guest list would always be the longest one kept anywhere in the 9 worlds. Beneath even that hall the road did not end. It ran past the long table and its unbroken line of new arrivals. It ran on further down and further north still, into a 9th world darker than the one Thorvald had already crossed. None of Hel's ordinary guests would ever be made to see it. It led toward a shore that had a name of its own. Something on that shore had been waiting for company for longer than the mound dwellers had been watching their hills. Part 5. Nastrond. Thorvald never saw what lay beyond Hel's hall. Neither did most of the dead who sat down at her table. The straw death that had brought him there carried him no further than his own bench and his own portion of hunger. But the road under the 3rd root of the world tree did not end at Eljudnir's gates. It went on, past even the Queen's own walls, down into a darkness. The old telling called that darkness Niflhel, the dark below the dark. A soul had already walked through 9 nights of darkness, and that darkness had not been dark enough to earn a name of its own. Nothing grew in Niflhel, and nothing had ever grown there. The ground, where it could be felt at all, was cold in a way that reached past skin. It settled into whatever a dead man had left to feel with. There was no wind, and yet the cold moved anyway. It moved the way water moved in a sealed jar that had been tipped, slow and total. A soul walking that stretch of road heard no river this time. There was no Gual roaring between its banks. There was nothing at all except its own footsteps, and somewhere ahead a sound too low and too steady to be mistaken for weather. The dark itself would have been enough to turn most travellers back. But turning back had never been a road anyone was permitted to walk twice. Eventually the road ran out onto a shore. The old poems called it Nastrond, which meant the corpse strand. The name was not a figure of speech. The sand of it, if it was sand, held bones the way an ordinary beach held shells. They were pale fragments, worked smooth by nothing anyone could name. No tide had ever been seen to move on that black water. There were ribs half buried at the waterline. Small bones lay scattered further up, where nothing had disturbed them in what looked like centuries. Every so often there was a skull, face down, as though it had simply been set there and left. The smell that hung over the whole strand was not decay exactly. Nothing there decayed the way anything decayed above ground. It was closer to the smell of a forge quenched too many times in the same water. It was iron and cold ash, and something faintly sour underneath both. Fog sat low over everything and never lifted. Out of that fog, long before a traveller reached it, rose the shape of a hall. A soul had to stand close to that hall before the shape of it stopped being merely strange. Only then did it become something worse. Its walls were not built of timber or stone. They were woven the way a fence of willow might be woven out of the backs of serpents. Hundreds of them lay side by side and bound into each other. Their spines formed the lattice, and their heads were left free at the ends. The heads were turned inward and driven up through the roof of the hall. They hung down into the hall itself from above. Venom ran from those heads without pause. It was a slow, continuous drip through the smoke hole, where smoke would have risen from any ordinary house. No telling of that hall ever gave a reason for it to stop. It struck the floor in a sound almost like rain, but it fell steadier than any rain had ever fallen. Drop following drop at exactly the same interval, on and on. There was nothing like a season to it and nothing like an end. The floor of the hole took that venom the way any floor took rain that would not stop falling. What the venom fed was not a fire, it fed rivers. Inside and around that hole ran channels of venom instead of water. They were thigh-deep in most places and colder even than the ground outside. Through those channels waded men who could not leave them. They would not ever be permitted to try. They were sorted by what they had done rather than by how they had died. Murderers waded there, men who had killed in blood or in cold calculation, both. There were 3 of them to every stretch of river, long enough to hold 3 men abreast. Oath-breakers waded beside them. They had sworn a word aloud before witnesses and broken it anyway. Sworn word carried a weight in the 9 worlds that ordinary speech did not. Breaking one was treated as a kind of theft from every person who had trusted it. Beside both of these waded men who had gone into another man's bed while the husband was away at sea or at war, they had stayed there past any hour that could be called innocent. They had been found out or not found out and drowned in venom regardless either way. It was the broken word and the broken trust that put a man in that river. It was not the manner of the killing and not the shape of the sin. Nothing was ever said there about what a man had or had not believed. What was said concerned only what he had sworn and failed to keep. No plea made from inside that current had ever shortened it by an hour. Unaware of that, a few newly arrived men argued their case aloud to no one. They listed wrongs they had never meant. None of the 3 groups spoke much to the others after that. None of them tried to climb out, since the banks of that river offered nothing to climb toward. A man waded facing whichever direction he had faced when he first entered the current. Most of them, over time, simply stopped turning around at all. But a few kept talking. They talked in the low, worn-down way of men who had run out of anything new to say to each other decades before. They kept talking anyway, because silence in that current would have been one discomfort too many to bear alongside the cold. One of them was called Steinar. What had put him in the river was a single sentence spoken years before. He had spoken it to a sworn brother he had fought beside since boyhood. It was a promise to guard that man's wife and land while he was away raiding. Steinar had kept that promise for exactly 1 winter before breaking it in every sense the word allowed. The venom did not burn the way fire burned. It worked slower, a cold spreading ache that never finished arriving. A man waded through it, feeling perpetually on the edge of a pain that would never quite complete itself. Steinar had been wading for longer than he could measure. There was no sun in Niflhel to mark a day by, and no season to mark a year. How long? He said once to another man wading near him, a stranger whose crime he had never learned and never asked after. Long enough that the question stopped mattering, the other man replied, and did not look up from the venom moving slow and black around his knees. What Steinar felt, hearing that answer, was not despair exactly. Despair required some remaining hope to be despaired of. It was closer to the flat, wordless recognition of a man who understood all at once and completely. The winter he had broken his oath in was the only winter that had ever mattered. Every winter since had simply been that same mistake, repeating. He would go on wading in that same current tomorrow, and the day after. Neither word meant anything in a place with no sun to mark either one. He would go on not turning around, because nothing that lay behind him was worth a turning. Something else lived in that dark besides the waders and the serpents, woven into the walls. Down at the very root of the world tree, a dragon gnawed. It was the third root, the one that hung out over Niflheim, and now it turned out over Nastrond as well. His name was Nidhogg, which meant the hate striker. He had been at that root since before any of the dead, now wading the venom rivers, had been born. He worked through wood the way rot worked through wood, except that this rot had teeth and intention behind it. But the root was not his only meal. When he tired of gnawing, or simply wanted a change from it, Nidhogg rose from below. He came up onto the corpse strand to feed on the bodies of those the venom had finally finished with. Even in Niflhel, a body could eventually give out entirely and stop being a man at all. He was long enough that no single traveller on the strand claimed to have seen the whole of him at once. They saw only a length of dark scale sliding past in the fog, and then another length, and then some time later the tail. He fed without hurry and without any appetite that ever looked satisfied. He went back down to the root afterwards. He resumed gnawing exactly where he had left off, as though the feeding had been an interruption rather than a purpose. High above all of it, the trunk of the world tree ran up out of that same dark. It rose toward daylight and worlds that still had weather in them. No one standing on Nastrond could have seen where it ended. An eagle sat at its crown, and the dragon gnawed at its root. The two of them had disliked each other for so long that neither could remember which had insulted the other first. Between them ran a squirrel, back and forth along the whole enormous length of the trunk. He carried each insult down to the root, and each reply back up to the crown, over and over, tirelessly. He was the one piece of real movement in the entire vast, still structure of the tree. His name was Ratatosk, a name that meant something close to the biting tusk, or the gnaw tooth. It was a small name anywhere else in the 9 worlds, and entirely at home in this one. Neither the eagle nor the dragon would ever climb down or fly down to settle the quarrel directly. So the squirrel would go on running, the insults would go on travelling the length of the trunk in both directions for as long as the tree itself continued to stand. The tree stood above the corpse strand and the venom rivers and the woders in them. It stood the way a single tall thing stood above a low, dark landscape, visible from any direction, unmoved by any of it. Its third root ran down past Niflheim, past the frost that had been there since before the first god walked. It ran down into the very dark where Nidhogg fed and gnawed and fed again. That root, patient as the rest of the tree, went on thinning, one bite at a time, 1 century at a time. Above it, the small, quick shape of the squirrel kept running the length of the trunk. The gnawing at the bottom of everything went on, and did not stop, and had never once been heard to stop. Part 6. Baldr's dreams of all the dead who had ever walked down the road beneath that root, one was wanted back more than any other. He was not the first to be sent to hell, and he would not be the last. But no other death ever put a god on the Helviger with a bargain in his mouth, and no other name was carried into every hall in the 9 worlds at once. His trouble did not begin with a wound, it did not begin with a blade, or a quarrel, or a broken oath. It began with a dream, and then a second dream, and then a third on 3 nights running. His name was Baldr. Some said the name meant the bold one, and others said it meant the bright, and both suited him well enough. He was a son of Odin and of Frigg, and he was reckoned the best of the Aesir. Light came off him that was said plainly without hedging as a fact about his body and not about his character. The whitest flower that grew in the north was named for his eyebrow, because nothing else in that country was so pale. He was gentle in speech and even in judgment, and men praised his fairness in every hall that had a fire in it. But some told it differently, and said that no judgment of Baldr's ever held, and they did not say why. He lived in a hall called Breidablik, the broad gleaming, and that hall was known for one thing above all others. Nothing unclean had ever been inside it. No oath had ever been broken under its roof. No blood had ever gone into its floor. The benches were laid with wool dyed in soft colours. The crossbeams carried gold in thin beaten strips. The light indoors never seemed to need the torches that stood ready along the walls. Frost did not form on the sills at Breidablik. Whatever weather stood outside, the air within stayed mild, and smelled of clean wood and beeswax, and the smoke of a fire that was always small. Asgard around it went on with its ordinary business. Smoke stood straight up out of 100 roofs in the cold mornings. Horses were shod, ale was carried in from the brewhouse, disputes were argued and settled, and would be argued again the following spring. It was the safest place that had ever been built, and everyone living in it knew so, and slept accordingly. Then the dreams came. They came to Baldr 3 nights running, and they were heavy dreams. Heavy was the word used for them afterwards, when men still spoke of it. He did not remember them the way a man remembered a bad night and shook it off at the door. He remembered them the way a man remembered weather that had already begun. In each of them something was ending, slowly and without anger, and the thing that was ending was himself. He said nothing on the first morning, he said nothing on the second. On the third he came late to the table, and sat down and did not eat. The whole hall noticed, because Baldr had never once in his life been quiet at a meal. Frigg watched her son turn his cup without drinking from it. She had borne him, and she knew the shape of his silences, and this was not one she had seen before. When he told them, the Aesir took counsel about it, as they took counsel about everything. They sat the whole day. They spoke of warding and of watchmen and of sending word to the wise. They could decide nothing at all, which was rare among them and frightening. A dream was not an enemy. There was nothing to bind and nothing that would hold still to be killed. But Odin did not wait for the council to reach its end. He went out of the doors while men were still speaking, and down to the stable, and saddled the grey horse himself. The horse was Sleipnir, the sliding one, the smooth goer, and he had 8 legs and a stride that ate the ground without seeming to hurry over it. Odin told no one where he was going. He took no spear, no gold, and no companion of any kind. He rode out of Asgard in the dark, downward and northward. He had ridden that road once before, a very long time ago, carrying a half-dead child across the saddle in front of him. He knew exactly what he had built at the bottom of it, because he had built it himself, out of one decision in one afternoon. The valleys went down, and the dark went with them. There was frost on the stone and no wind to move it. After a long while a hound came up the road towards him out of that dark, and Odin knew the hound and did not slow the horse. Its breast was wet with blood, and the blood was fresh, and it bayed at him with its head low. It followed him a distance, howling, and then fell back to the chain that would hold it a while yet. Odin rode on and did not look behind him. He came at last within sight of the high eastern gate of Hel's hall, and there he turned aside, because what he had come for was not inside it. East of the gate the ground rose into a low mound with no marker on it. Under that mound lay a Volva, one of the women who had carried the staff in life and seen forward into what had not yet happened. She had been dead so long that the grass on her grave had grown and died back, and grown again more times than the living had names for. Odin got down and left the horse standing. He walked to the head of the mound and stood there and began to sing. What he sang was a corpse spell, the words that made the dead answer whether they wished to answer or not. He faced north while he sang it. He did not hurry any part of it, and the ground under the grave began to work slowly, the way water worked under thin ice. She came up unwilling. Snow had fallen on her, and rain had beaten her, and dew had wet her. She stood at the top of her own grave and looked at the man who had woken her. "What man is this," she said, "unknown to me, who has made me travel so weary a road? Snowed on me, rain beat me, dew wet me, I have been dead a long while." "My name is Vegtam," Odin replied, "and I am the son of Valtam." The first name meant one at home on any road, and the second meant one at home in battle, and neither of them was true. "Tell me the news of Hel, and I will tell you the news of the world above. For whom are those benches strewn? For whom is that floor covered over with gold?" "Here stands mead brewed for Baldr," she said, "the bright drink, and a shield laid over the vat to keep it. The benches are strewn, and the hangings are hung, and the bed is made up. The sons of the Aesir are in despair, though they do not yet know that they are. I have spoken unwilling now, I will be silent." Odin stood in the dark and turned it over. The hall was ready, not preparing, not making ready, but finished and waiting, with the ale already brewed and covered against dust, which meant it had been standing some while. A house that received nothing but the dead had made up a bed for a man who was still alive, and set out his cup and gone quiet. And he knew whose house it was, and what its rule was, because the rule was his own. He had carried the girl down this road and given her the 9 worlds. He had told her she must lodge and feed all who were sent to her without exception forever. She had asked him for nothing since. She would not need to. The law he had written that afternoon, to be rid of a child he had already judged, would close on his son. "Be not silent, Volva," Odin said. "I will ask until I have all of it. Who will be Baldr's slayer? Who will take the life of Odin's son?" "Hod will carry the high branch there," she replied. "He will be Baldr's slayer. He will take the life of Odin's son." I have spoken unwilling, now I will be silent. Be not silent. Who will avenge the deed? Who will bring the killer to the fire? A woman called Rind will bear a son in the western halls, she said. Vali will be his name, and he will fight at one night old. He will not wash his hands nor comb his hair until he has carried Baldr's slayer to the pyre. But Odin asked a third time. He asked who the women were who would weep at that burning and toss their neck veils up into the sky. The dead woman did not answer that one, because a man who asked it already knew, and only one man in the 9 worlds could have known it. You are not Vegtam, she said. You are Odin, and you are old, and you have come a long way to be told the thing you already suspected. And you are no Volva, Odin replied, and no wise woman either, but the mother of 3 giants. Ride home, then, and be proud of it. No man will ride down to visit me again until Loki is loose out of his bonds and the destroyers come. Then she lay back down into her grave, and the earth closed over her, and the mound was a low rise in the dark with no marker on it. Odin rode up out of the valleys with the whole of it in his hands and no use for any part of it. He knew the killer's name and the avenger's name, and that the mead would be waiting under its bright shield. Speaking any of it aloud would have altered nothing, and he had lived long enough to know that too. He came back into Asgard in the grey before morning, and stabled the horse himself. Then he walked into a hall where his son sat alive at the table, with light coming quietly off his hands. Part 7. The mistletoe. Odin said nothing about the ride when he came back. He told the council that he had been out on the road, that dreams were dreams, and that the matter was closed. For 3 days nothing in Asgard changed at all. The work of the year went on as it always had. Baldr still ate less than he used to, but Frigg had watched her son turn his cup without drinking, and she had not stopped seeing it. On the 4th morning she went out of the doors of Fensalir alone, to ask the world for a promise. Fensalir was her own hall. The name meant the halls of the fen, because the ground there was soft, and the water lay in flat sheets between the reeds. She did not call a council, and she did not take a companion. She went first to the fire on her own hearth. She asked it to swear that it would never harm her son, and the fire swore. Then she went down to the sea and stood in the cold shallows until the water swore as well. She asked it of the iron next, and of every metal men had dug out of the ground. She asked it of the stones, one field at a time. She asked it of the earth, which took the longest, because the earth was large. She asked it of the trees, from the oak to the ash to the small crooked thorn that would grow where nothing else stood. She asked it of the sicknesses which were harder to find. They had to be spoken to where they lived, in the lungs of old men and in the blood of small children. She asked it of the beasts on 4 legs and the birds on 2. She asked it of venom, and last of all of the serpents. Everything swore. Nothing refused. Frigg walked home over the wet ground with the whole world's word in her hand. She was a mother who had done something, and that was better than waiting. What followed was a game, and it lasted most of a summer. The Aesir came out to the assembly field in the long light after the day's work. The grass in the middle was worn down to bare dirt in a ring, from years of men standing there to argue. They set Baldr in the middle of the ring and threw things at him. They threw stones first, because stones were nearest. The stones came off him the way hail came off a roof and fell in the grass at his feet. Then they shot at him. Arrows turned aside a hand's breadth from his shoulder and went into the turf with a soft thud. Boys ran out between rounds and gathered them up by the armful. Then they struck at him with axes and with swords. They struck hard, the way a man struck when he meant it, and the edges slid away and buried themselves in the ground. But nobody threw gently after the first evening. A god who held back was laughed at for it. So they came at him with everything they had, and it made no difference at all. Nobody was hurt, and everybody laughed. It was the laughter of men who had been frightened and had stopped being frightened. Ale was carried out to the field in the evenings. Old men sat on the bank arguing which throw had come closest, though none had come close. The grass filled with arrows and spear shafts standing at angles, like a crop nobody had thought to harvest. The low sun came through them and laid long shadows across the field. Baldr stood in the middle of it with his arms at his sides. He did not laugh much, and he never asked them to stop. Some said afterwards that he had liked being the one thing in the world that could not be broken. Others said he had simply understood that his mother needed the game more than he did. He stood there, evening after evening, while the iron went past him. The dreams did not come back, and everyone agreed that the trouble had passed and would not come again. Loki stood at the edge of the field and watched the arrows go into the grass. What he felt was not anything as clean as hatred. It was the flat, sour discomfort of a man watching a thing that would not break. He left before the light was gone. Somewhere on the way he changed his shape. What came up the path to Fensalir was an old woman in a grey wool cloak, walking slowly, leaning as she went. Frigg was standing in her own doorway. She was a courteous woman, and she asked the old woman inside, "Do you know what the Aesir are doing out on the field?" The old woman said, "They are throwing at my son," Frigg replied, "and nothing they throw will touch him. All things have sworn oaths not to harm Baldr. All things." The old woman said, "Every one of them with none left out." All things. Frigg said, "Fire and water, iron and every metal, the stones and the earth and the trees, the sicknesses and the beasts and the birds, venom and the serpents. There grows one shoot west of Valhalla, and men call it Mistletoe." It seemed to me too young to ask an oath of. The old woman thanked her and went out, and Frigg went back to her weaving out on the field. The throwing went on into the dusk. Unaware that the game had already ended, unaware that the last easy laughter of the age had already been laughed, the Aesir went on throwing. They stood in their ring in the worn grass around a man who would be dead before the dew fell. Loki went west of Valhalla and found the plant. It grew high on an oak, a small pale green thing with berries like beads of tallow. It held to the branch and had no roots in the ground. He pulled it up and carried it down and shaped a dart out of it. The wood was so soft that the knife went through it like cheese. Was standing outside the ring when Loki came back. He was Baldr's brother, and his name meant warrior. He had never fought anyone, because he was blind and always had been. He stood where the noise was, listening to the arrows land. "Why are you not throwing at Baldr with the others?" Loki said, "Because I cannot see where he is standing," Hod replied, "and because I have nothing to throw." "You should do as the rest are doing and honor him," Loki said. "I will show you where he stands. Throw this shaft at him." Took the dart in his hand, Loki set his fingers on the blind man's shoulders and turned him square to the middle of the ring. He lifted the arm and held it a moment, to be certain of the line, threw the way a man threw when he was being kind. The shaft went through Baldr and out the other side of him. He fell forward onto the grass, dead before his knees reached it. Then there was no sound on the field at all. The gods stood and looked at the body and could not speak. When at last they made a sound, it was only weeping, because words would not come to any of them. But not one of them lifted a hand against Hod, and not one lifted a hand against Loki. The assembly field was a holy place, a place of peace, and no blood could be shed on it for any cause. So they stood in the sanctuary they had made, over the greatest misfortune ever worked among gods and men, and did nothing at all. They carried him down to the sea. His own ship lay there on the rollers. It was called Hringhorni, the ring-proud, and it was the greatest of all ships ever built. They meant to launch it and build the pyre on the deck of it, in the old way. But the ship would not move. Every god in Asgard put a shoulder to it, and it did not shift the width of a hand. So they said to Jotunheim for a giantess called Hyrrokin, whose name meant the fire-smoked, the one wrinkled by flame. She came riding a wolf with live vipers for reins. When she got down, 4 berserks were set to hold the beast. They could not hold it, and had to throw it to the ground and lie across it. Hyrrokin walked to the prow and pushed once. The ship went down the rollers so hard that fire sprang out of the wood of them, and every land in the world shook. Thor's hand went to the hammer, and he would have broken her skull there on the sand. All the other gods asked peace for her, and he let it go. Baldr's body was carried aboard. When Nanna, his wife, saw it, laid down on the deck, her heart burst in her breast with grief. She died there on the sand, and they laid her on the pyre beside her husband. Some said her name meant the daring one. His horse was led aboard with all its harness, and killed there. Odin took the ring Draupnir off his own arm and laid it down beside his son. The ring was called the Dripper, because every 9th night 8 rings of the same weight dripped out of it. Thor stood over the pyre and hallowed it with the hammer. A dwarf called Lit, whose name meant colour, ran in front of his feet while he was doing it. Thor kicked him into the fire, and he burned with the rest of them. Before the flame was set, Odin bent down over the body. He put his mouth close to his son's ear and said something. Nobody on that shore heard it. No one ever knew what he said. Long afterwards, a giant put that very question to him in a contest of knowledge, and Odin would not answer it. Then they lit it and pushed the ship out, and it burned as it went. Frigg stood on the sand with the smoke going over her. She asked who among them would ride down the long road, and offer the queen of that country a ransom for her son. Out on the water the ship burned lower and drifted further, until it was only a small red mark on the dark going north. Part 8, Hermod's Ride. Nobody answered Frigg at once. The gods stood on the sand with the smoke blowing along it and looked at one another, and the sea kept coming in. Then one of them said that he would go. His name was Hermod. Men called him Hermod the Bold, and the name itself meant something close to courage in war. He was a son of Odin. He had ridden errands for his father before, though never one like this. Odin had the grey horse brought down to the shore. He did not say anything when he handed over the reins, because there was nothing that needed saying. Hermod rode out that same evening, downward and northward. For 9 nights he saw nothing at all, and that was the plain fact of it. The valleys he went down were so deep and so dark that the dark stopped being a thing outside him and became the whole of the world. He could not see the horse's neck in front of him. He could not see his own hands on the reins. He rode by the sound of the hoofs and by the way the ground tilted, and by nothing else. There was frost on the stone, and he could hear it break under the shoes. The air smelled of wet rock and old ash. No wind moved down there, and no star showed. In all those 9 nights the dark never thinned enough to be called evening rather than night. He passed no houses and no fires. Once or twice he thought he heard someone walking a long way off, going the same way he was going. He did not call out to them after a while. The sound was not there any more. He was not hungry on that road, which he noticed and did not like. He was not tired either. But the horse never once broke its stride and never asked for water, and it seemed to know the way in a manner that a man would not have wanted explained to him. Its breath came back to him warm in the cold, and it was the only warm thing on that road. He counted the nights by it for a while, and then he stopped counting and simply went on, because turning around would have been the same darkness in the other direction. But on the 9th night the sound changed. Water came up out of the dark ahead, a great cold roaring of it, and then the ground levelled, and then there was light. It was the bridge, roofed and thatched over with shining gold. The gold gave back enough light to see by, after 9 nights of seeing nothing. The river Goal ran under it, loud, full of the things it always carried. Hermod put the horse onto the planks, and the bridge rang. It rang the way a floor rang under a running man. It did not stop ringing, and the sound went out over the water in both directions. At the far end the maiden who kept the bridge stood and watched him come. The gold overhead threw a dull yellow down onto her hands and onto the planks in front of her. She waited until he was most of the way across before she said anything at all. "What is your name?" she called out. "What is your kin?" 5 hosts of dead men rode over this bridge on the 5 days before this one, and it did not thunder under all of them together as it thunders under you alone. And you have not the colour of a dead man. Why do you ride here, on the road down to HEL? "My name is Hermod, and I am a son of Odin," he replied. "I ride to look for Baldr. Have you seen him pass this way?" "Baldr rode over this bridge," she said, "but the road to HEL lies downward and northward." She looked at him a moment longer than she needed to, the way a woman looked at whether she would not see again. Then she stood aside and let him go by. He rode on until the gate stood in front of him, high and shut. In a wall he could not see the end of in either direction. He got down. He tightened the girth by 2 holes. He checked the buckles with his fingers, because there was no light to check them by. Then he mounted again and set the spurs in. The grey horse went up and over the gate so high that it came nowhere near it. It landed on the far side without breaking stride and carried him in. The hall was warmer than the road had been, which was not the same thing as warm. Torchlight moved along the walls and did not reach the roof. The benches ran the whole length of it. The dead sat along them in a quiet that had nothing unhappy in it. A servant crossed the floor so slowly that Hermod could not be certain it was crossing at all. The dish they were served from was the one called Hunger, and the knife beside it was the one called Famine, and neither of them would ever be enough. The hangings behind the high seat gave back a faint gleam wherever the torchlight found them. At the far end, in that high seat, his brother was sitting. Nanna sat beside him with her hands folded. Baldr had the colour of that country now, and no light came off him any more. But he stood up when he saw who had come, and he put both arms round his brother and held on to him. There was drink poured on the table in front of the high seat in good cups. It had been standing there long enough for a skin to form on the top of it. Neither of them had touched any of it. Neither of them would. Hermod stayed the night in that hall. They did not talk about the field or the dart or the ship. Baldr did not once ask who had done it. They talked instead about small things in low voices, the way men talked late at night. Baldr asked whether the barley had gone in before the burning, and whether their father was sleeping. Nanna asked after Frigg, and after a woman she had left a piece of weaving with, and whether it had ever been finished. The torches burned down and were not replaced, and nobody minded the dark. Now and then someone far down the hall turned over on a bench, and the sound carried the whole length of the room, and then the quiet came back over it. It was, in its way, the most peaceful night Hermod had ever spent. That was what he could not get out of his mind afterward. His brother was not suffering, and was not angry, and was not waiting for rescue in any manner Hermod could see. He was sitting at the head of a long, quiet hall with his wife beside him, and nothing to do until the world ended. Hermod slept a few hours on a bench with his cloak over him. No dream came to him, and the cold sat on him like wool. But morning came even in that country in its own way, without any sun to bring it. He went and found the queen of that house, and asked her for his brother back. She was standing at the end of her own table when he found her, and the slow servants were moving somewhere behind her. He said what he had been sent to say. He told her how much weeping there was in Asgard, and what Baldr had been to the world above, and that the Aesir would give her whatever ransom she named. HEL heard the whole of it without interrupting him. She did not smile, and she did not sharpen her voice, and there was nothing in her face that wanted anything from him. It will be put to the test, she said, whether he is loved as much as men say he is. If all things in the 9 worlds, living and dead, weep for him, then he shall go back up to the Aesir. But if any one thing speaks against it, or will not weep, then he shall stay here with me. She said it the way a woman read out a measure of grain. It was not a punishment, and it was not a bargain struck to be broken, and she made no claim about how it would end. She had been given a house and a rule, and told to keep both. She had kept them a very long time without once being asked for an exception. She was not making one now. Baldr walked him out to the gate. He took the ring Draupnir, which had gone on to the pyre with him and come down the road in his hand. He gave it back for Hermod to carry up to Odin. He said it was a keepsake, and he did not say anything else about it. Nanna sent Frigg a linen shift, folded small, and some other gifts of hers besides. To Fulla she sent a gold finger ring. Fulla's name meant the bountiful one, and she carried Frigg's box and knew everything Frigg knew, and she had been kind to Nanna when Nanna was young. Then the gate was behind him, and the road was under him again, and the 9 nights went the other way. He came up out of the last valley in the grey before morning, with the gold ring heavy inside his glove. All the way home the thing sounded easy. Everything in the 9 worlds had loved Baldr, and everything in the 9 worlds would weep for him, and there was nothing anywhere that would want to be the one to refuse. Part 9. Thokk. The grey light widened around him as he rode the last of it home. He came into Asgard, still wearing the road on his cloak. He gave Odin the ring. Then he gave Frigg the message word for word, the way HEL had spoken it. It would be tested whether Baldr was loved as much as men said. If all things in the 9 worlds wept for him, he would come home. The Aesir heard it and did not wait even a day. Messengers went out that same hour, riding to every corner of creation. They went into every hall and every field and every cave where a thing might live or simply be. They asked each one to weep Baldr out of hell. They rode unaware that one voice among all of them would refuse, but that one refusal would be enough to undo the whole errand. And the weeping came. Men wept for him first in every hall of Midgard, farmers and kings alike. The grief had gone ahead of the riders and was already loose before anyone asked for it. Beasts wept for him too, or did what passed for weeping in a beast. Oxen stood low in their stalls with their heads down. Horses trembled along their flanks, as though sorrow could be smelled on the wind that carried it. The earth wept. Where the messengers walked, the frost softened under their feet, as if the ground itself had gone soft with grief. It was still deep winter in every land they crossed. The stones wept next, and it was an old plain thing. Anyone who had ever carried cold stone in from a winter field knew it. The stone would sweat once it was set down by a fire. It beaded over with water it had not held a moment before because it was cold and the room was warm and the two could not agree. That was how the weeping of the stones for Baldr was told. No one who heard it asked for a better explanation. The trees wept, running long lines of water down their bark, the way resin ran, though it was not resin. And every metal wept in exactly the manner the stones had wept. Each was carried cold out of the frost into somewhere warmer than itself. Iron sweated dark on its rack in the smithy, gold sweated in the box where it was kept. An axe head by a door misted over as though it had been breathed on. Every kettle in every kitchen ran wet down its sides that week. Every clasp on every wool cloak stood beaded before the fire beneath it had even been lit. It was, by every account, the only time such a thing happened to every hearth in the 9 worlds at once. None of it needed to be asked twice. The messengers went on, into places the roads scarcely reached. Under the mountains the frost giants wept. Big slow tears down faces the size of cliffs. Even the wind through Jotunheim's passes was said to have carried the sound of it for days. Out past the world's edge the dwarves wept in their halls of stone and dark. They set down their hammers to do it, though hammers were the only thing most of them ever set down for anything. In the sea or so, it was told, even Ran's net ran wet with more than salt. The drowned who sat at her table put down their cups and wept with the rest, glad of a grief that was not their own for once. Sickness itself was asked and wept, fire was asked and wept, hissing where its own tears struck it. It seemed for a while that there was nothing left in all creation that had not been asked and had not answered. But in a cave, far off from any road, the messengers found a giantess sitting alone. They asked her the same question they had asked everything else. She sat on bare stone with nothing spread beneath her. She did not rise to meet them, and she did not weep. She gave her name as Thokk, which meant thanks, but she said nothing further about who she was or where she had come from. The messengers explained it to her carefully, the way they had explained it 1,000 times that week. Baldr was dead. All things were being asked to weep him free of hell. Her tears alone might be the ones still wanted. Thokk let them finish. Then she answered. Her voice in the cave was flat and without hurry, as if she had already decided the matter long before they arrived. Thokk will weep dry tears for Baldr's burying. The old man's son was no good to me alive, and he is no good to me dead. Let hell hold what she has, she said. She said it once and did not soften it and did not repeat it. The messengers waited a while in the cave in case she meant to say more. But she only sat, and the silence went on, being the same silence it had been before they arrived. There was nothing more to ask her, nothing to bargain with. She wanted nothing that any of them could offer. They left the cave and carried the answer back the way they had carried the question. The answer did not change on the road. One thing in the 9 worlds had not wept, and the bargain had said all things. So Baldr stayed in the hall he had already been shown, seated where the shield already covered the vat. Many believed that the giantess in the cave had not been a giantess at all. The belief settled quickly and never really left. Loki had done the Aesir more harm than any other living thing. This, coming at the end of so much other harm, looked exactly like the rest of his work, quiet, deniable, and delivered from inside a shape that was not his own. No one had seen him go into the cave, and no one had seen him come out of it. That, too, looked like him. Loki fled before the Aesir could lay hands on him up into the mountains. He built himself a house with 4 doors, so that he could watch every direction at once. He could be gone through whichever one the danger was not coming from. By day he took the shape of a salmon and lay in the pool below Frangang's falls, where the water ran fast and white and hid him under its noise. He sat by his own hearth one evening with his mind on nets rather than on hiding. It was there that he first twisted cord into mesh and knotted it the way every net would be knotted ever after. He burned it in the fire the moment he heard the Aesir coming up the mountain, so that no one would find the pattern in his hands. But Odin, seeing far as he always saw, found the shape of it anyway in the ash left on the hearthstone. The Aesir wove a net from what the ash had shown them, and went down to the pool to drag it. Twice the salmon slipped the net, once he lay flat against the riverbed under the sweep of it. Once he leapt clean over the men holding it at the falls. The 3rd time Thor waded into the current himself. He caught the fish by the tail as it leapt and held on, though the water was fast and the fish was strong. That was why ever afterwards the salmon carried a tail narrower than the rest of its body, tapering where a god's hand had closed on it and nearly let it go. They carried Loki down into a cave and bound him there to 3 flat stones with the entrails of his own son. 2 sons had come with him into hiding. One was named Vali, the same name already promised to the babe who would one day avenge Baldr. The other was named Narfi. Narfi's brother was turned into a wolf's shape and tore him apart where he stood. It was his entrails that the Aesir used for the binding. They hardened to iron the moment they touched Loki's skin and would not be cut through again. Skadi, who had her own grievance against him from her father's death, came and fixed a venomous serpent above his upturned face. Its poison fell steadily onto him where he lay. His wife Sigyn stayed with him and held a bowl above his face to catch what the serpent dripped, and did not leave him for it. What kept her kneeling there through so many years of the same venom and the same bowl was never explained by anyone who told the story afterwards. She never once explained it herself, but the bowl filled as any bowl filled with anything dripping into it long enough. When it was full, she had to turn away to empty it. In the moment before she came back, the venom struck him unshielded, and the whole earth shook with what he did under it. Men called that shaking an earthquake, and never troubled to wonder further about it. The Volva had already said what it would take before anyone would ride down to Hel's road again. Loki bound in that cave was exactly that. The bowl went on filling, drop by drop, in the dark under the mountain far longer than anyone counted. It would be a very long wait before it mattered to any road or any gate or anyone still walking above him. Part 10. Brynhild's ride, the god had been refused the one road he wanted open. The cave under the mountain had shut over him with the bowl still catching what fell. But the older road had never once closed. It ran down and north beneath the third route, and it went on carrying whoever came to it. Not long after, by the reckoning kept in Midgard, a shield maiden named Brynhild died by her own hand. She was carried out to a pyre built high enough for two. The road took her the way it took everyone, without asking whether she agreed to go. Her body was burned on a pyre raised beside a fjord, hung about with woven cloth and shields. Beside it stood a wagon built for the burning. Its wheels were bound in iron, and its bed was lined with the same tapestries that had hung in her hall. It was the custom among people of her rank to be sent into death-riding rather than walking. So her body was laid in the wagon, and the wagon itself was given to the flames, wheels and axle and all. Whatever remained of her would go down the road already seated rather than on foot. The smoke stood a long time over the fjord before the wind took it. What came up out of the ash and travelled on was the wagon itself, whole again the way things were whole again on that road. It rattled forward on its bound wheels along a track that ran level and grey at the very edge of Hel's country. The track lay neither fully inside the gate nor fully outside it. The road there ran between low mounds on either side, turf-covered and old. Each one was a door into the ground. It belonged to someone who had chosen to stay near where they had lived rather than travel the whole distance down. Frost lay thin over the turf, even where the fires that burned the dead nearby still smoked faintly on the wind. Stones stood set upright at some of the doors, worn smooth of whatever had once been cut into them. At others nothing marked the ground at all beyond a low green swelling. The grass had grown thick and undisturbed for longer than anyone above had kept count. The wagon's wheels left no mark on ground that had already given up being marked by anything. The iron bands around them had glowed and buckled in the fire that made them. Now they rolled cool and whole, as if they had never burned at all. There was no crowd on that stretch of road and no gate yet in sight, only the mounds. The wagon moved between them at the unhurried pace of something that had nowhere left to arrive early. Wool and cloth still lay folded across the wagon's bed exactly as they had been laid at the burning. They were singed at their edges and no further, as though the fire had agreed to leave that much of her behind her. But at one of the mound doors a giantess stood waiting, tall and grey as the turf itself. She would not let the wagon pass. She had died there long before, and she kept her mound the way some of the dead kept theirs, watching the road that ran past her own door. She knew the woman in the wagon on sight, or believed she did. Wagon and wain shall not pass over my walls. It ill becomes you to travel in a dead man's place. You are no daughter of kings, though you wear the state of one. 8 nights you slept beside a man who was not your husband. You slept in a hall you had no right to keep. Your hands are wet with a husband-taker's dealings. You shall not pass while I stand here, she said. Brynhild did not raise her voice to answer her. She did not ask the wagon to stop moving while she did it. She spoke evenly, the way a woman recounted a debt already settled. She told the giantess who she was and what had been done to her. The giantess had judged the ending of a story without once having been told its middle. She said that she had been a shield maiden once. She had worn mail and carried a spear into battle at the side of men who thought her one of themselves. In one such battle she had given the victory to a young king Odin had already marked to lose. She had favoured courage over the god's own will, for that Odin had punished her. He pricked her with a sleep thorn and closed her inside a hall ringed with a wall of fire on a mountain. He said that she would sleep there until a man rode through the flame without fear and woke her. Whoever did would be the one she married. No other match would ever be offered her again. Many came near that mountain and none came through it. The fire was not for show. I lay behind it a long while. I did not count the years because there was nothing to count them by, she said. The hall itself stood plain inside the ring of flame, she said. It was timbered and low-roofed. There was nothing in it but the bed she had been laid on. Above that bed they had raised a shield to keep the weather off her face while she slept. The fire around it burned day and night without wood to feed it. It climbed the whole slope of the mountain in a wall no rider's horse would go near. Every man who tried it in those years had turned back at the first heat of it. Others had never come as far as the mountain at all, and had only heard of it and stayed away. But then a man had ridden through the wall of flame as though it were no more than mist across a field. He had lifted the helm from her sleeping face. He had cut the mail from her body where it had grown into her skin with long sleeping. She had woken and known at once that no other man could have done it. His name was Sigurd. He told her his own deeds plainly, without boasting of them. That was itself the first proof of who he was. They swore themselves to each other there on the mountain. The roads he still had to ride kept him from marrying her at once. So for 8 nights afterwards he laid a bare sword between them in one bed, edge up. No man could say afterwards that anything had passed between them that should not have. He kept that oath the whole 8 nights, though the sword was cold and neither of us was, she said. Sigurd rode on from the mountain into the hall of a king named Gunnar. Gunnar's mother, Brynhild, knew more of drink and herbcraft than any woman had any right to know. Brynhild brewed a cup for Sigurd that carried a forgetting in it stronger than any wine. She gave it to him at her own table. Sigurd drank it, not knowing what it was, the way a man drank anything set before him by his host's own mother. What he forgot was Brynhild. What he remembered in her place was Gudrun, Gunnar's sister, whom he married within the year. He never suspected that the mountain and the fire and the sword laid edge up between 2 bodies had ever happened to him at all. Gunnar himself wished to have Brynhild for his own wife. He rode to the mountain to win her through the fire. But his own horse would not carry him through flame that high, and neither would any horse he tried. So Sigurd rode the fire a second time, still carrying Gunnar's own likeness by a charm worked between the 2 men. He wore another man's face, and he won Brynhild a second time. He believed this time that he did it for his sworn brother rather than for himself. Brynhild came down off the mountain, believing she had married the man who had ridden through the fire. She did not learn otherwise until she and Gudrun stood arguing at the edge of a river over whose husband had done the greater deed. Gudrun, in the heat of the argument, told her plainly that it had been Sigurd under Gunnar's shape both times, on the mountain and at the ford. I learnt at a river bank what should have been told to me on a mountain. The water did not care how long I stood in it, working out what it meant. I had married one man, believing him to be the one who was never afraid of me. It was true, and it was also a lie. Both at once was more than I could go on carrying, Brynhild said. She said nothing further about what came after on that account. She said only that Sigurd had died for it, and that she had followed him onto the pyre by her own choosing rather than anyone else's. The story she had woken into on the mountain had never once been the story she was given. But the giantess at the mound door said nothing further to answer that. She stood aside from the road at last. Whether she stood aside from being persuaded or merely from being talked past was not something the wagon waited to find out. Sooner would I sink with him into the earth than live on above it, wearing a name that was never the true shape of my life, Brynhild said. Then the wagon rolled on, past the mound and past the giantess standing at her own door. The wheels went down into a mist that had been gathering unnoticed the whole time the two women spoke. The road ahead of the wagon would run level and grey for a very long way before it showed any sign of ending. Part 11. The living who walked down. The dead had never been given a choice about the road. It opened under them the moment they died. They walked it because there was nothing else left to do with their feet. But a small number of the living took that same road on purpose. Their hearts still beat and their breath still fogged in the cold of it. A smaller number still came back up again afterwards to tell what they had seen. Their stories were kept apart from the stories of the dead for exactly that reason. They alone had returned to describe it. What they described would be told and retold long after every one of them had finally gone down that road for good. One of them was a king of the Danes named Hadingus. He ruled in the years the old histories called the earliest. Kings then still married. Strange women without asking too many questions about where they had come from. In the depth of one winter the ground outside his hall lay frozen hard enough to ring underfoot. A woman rose up through the floorboards near his table. No door had opened, and no one had seen her enter the room. She carried in both hands a bundle of hemlock, cut fresh, its stalks green and its leaves unwilted. It was the kind of green that belonged to a warm month and not to the dead of winter at all. She held it out to him and asked where in the world such herbs could have been growing. Every field for 100 miles lay under frost, and had lain that way for months. Hadingus said he did not know and that he would like to know. The woman answered that she would show him. She wrapped him in her cloak. She carried him down with her through the same floor she had risen out of, whatever door there had been closed again the moment they passed it. It left him standing with her in a place lit by no sun he could find overhead. There was only a grey and even light that came from no single direction. A path ran ahead of them, worn smooth and hollow by the passing of feet. He saw no other feet on it besides their own. He saw only the wearing that such long use left behind on a road. Mist lay low along the path on both sides, thick enough to hide whatever ground it covered. It never once lifted the whole way they walked. The path came out at last into a meadow green and warm despite everything the winter above had been. Hadingus understood then where the hemlock the woman carried had been cut. Flowers grew there that no season above the ground would have permitted. They stood thick along both banks of a stream that fed the larger river ahead. The grass stood tall and undamaged by any frost or any grazing that would ordinarily have worn it down by that time of year. Beyond the meadow ran a river, its water the colour of iron gone dark and moving fast. Things turned over and over in its current as it went, a spear shaft, a shield rim, an axe with its haft still fitting. They were carried along the way. Sticks were carried on an ordinary river. A bridge crossed it, narrow and unrailed. It was roofed by nothing but the same grey light that lit the rest of the country. The two of them crossed by the bridge rather than trusting the water. Adingus looked down once as they crossed. He saw a helmet turn slowly under the surface before the current took it further on. He felt the sense that he had crossed water like it once before, though he could not have said when. On the far bank 2 armies stood locked together in battle, shield against shield. They had been fighting, by every sign of it, for longer than any war fought by the living had ever run. Neither side gained ground, and neither side gave any. The woman told him these were men who had died by the sword. They were still keeping up in death the very combat that had killed them. They were bound to finish a fight that had no ending built into it. Adingus understood, watching them, the particular horror of such a war. It could not be lost, because it could also never be won. That fight would go on, being fought long after every man now standing in it above ground had been forgotten by name. He was glad in that moment that his own road home still lay ahead of him rather than behind. But past the battlefield stood a wall, and the wall could not be climbed. It rose higher than any wall he had seen built by the hands of men. It offered no gate and no gap and no foothold anywhere along its length that he or the woman could find. Adingus did not yet know that the wall would need no climbing at all. It would need only a single small death offered up and thrown over it. The woman did not turn back from it. She took a cock she had been carrying, unnoticed until then, tucked under one arm the whole journey. She wrung its head from its body with both hands. Then she threw the head over the wall into whatever lay on the far side of it. A moment later the cock crowed whole again from beyond the wall where no living throat should have been able to answer. The sound of it carried back over stone that nothing else had ever carried back over. It was, the woman told him, proof enough of what that place could do to a dead thing. But it was proof enough too that Adingus himself was not yet meant to cross it. She turned him around then and led him back the whole way he had come, through the meadow and the mist. She set him again on the floor of his own hall as though he had never left it. A second king carried a story like it into the north, though he came by his own knowledge differently. Svipdag, whose name carried the sense of a sudden day-breaking, had lost his mother Groa while he was still a boy. Her own name was tied to growing and green things. She had been laid in a mound rather than burned, the way some of the old dead still were. When he grew to a man he needed guidance no living voice could give him. So he went to her mound door at night. He woke her the way the dead could sometimes be woken, by a son's voice calling down into the earth by name. Groa rose enough to hear him without rising further than that. She sang him 9 charms up out of the ground, one after another. Each one was a working against a different danger he would meet on the roads ahead. They guarded against flood, against frost, against a blade in the dark, against a river too deep to wade. He carried her 9 charms with him afterwards, the way another man might carry 9 tools. One was for a swollen river, one was for a blade raised against him in the dark, one was for a hostile wind on a sea already too high. He never once had to ask her again. Her voice, he said afterwards, had come up through the turf, sounding thinner than he remembered it. The ground itself seemed to blunt what little of her was left to send through it. But the mound had closed over the sound the moment the 9th charm was finished. Beneath both these stories lay an older custom. It had nothing to do with visiting the dead for their wisdom. It had everything to do with what the dead were still keeping. Barrows were broken open across the north for the goods buried inside them. Gold and weapons had been laid in with a body that a living man now wanted for himself. Mound breaking became its own kind of descent, undertaken with a spade instead of a woman's cloak. Grettir's strength was already spoken of before he ever went near a mound. He was lowered once on a rope into the grave mound of a man called Kar the Old. Kar was a farmer who had been buried with more gold than a farmer usually kept. He went down through the dark and the packed earth. The chamber below was built for one dead man and whatever he had been buried with. The rope above him swayed once and then went still. He stood alone in the closed dark of the mound with only what his own hands could find in front of him. He felt his way along a wall of timber. He turned up first the bones of a horse, still harnessed as it had been laid in. Past that he found a chest bound in iron, but past that he found a high seat set against the far wall. Something was sitting upright in it. His hands had not expected to find anything sitting upright at all. The air in the chamber was old and close and colder than the dug ground around it should have made it. For the length of one long breath, Grettir considered calling up the rope and being hauled out before he had taken anything from the dark at all. Not every mound gave up its dead so quietly. Not every man who went down on a rope came back up with only gold to show for it. A few of the men broke into those barrows for the treasure and the iron inside them. They woke something that had not stayed as still as a body in the ground was supposed to stay. It was something that would not simply go back into the earth just because the digging above it had stopped. Part 12, the dead that would not lie still. The thing sitting upright in Kar's high seat had a name in the north. So did what other men found waiting in the mounds they opened. The name was draugr. It meant the one who walked again after the walking should have been done with him. A draugr was not a ghost, and it was not a shade. It had never gone anywhere. It had stayed inside its own body, under its own turf, and when it stood up whole. The change in such a body was told the same way everywhere. The corpse did not dry and fall in as other corpses did. It swelled instead until the grave clothes strained along their seams. The colour went dark. Some said blue as death itself, and others said blue-black as old ale held up against a lamp. The weight came on with the colour. A body that 4 men had carried in easily could not be shifted by 8 the following spring. Strength came on with the weight. A draugr could break a horse's back across its knee, pull the turf roof off a bar in handfuls, or crush a man against a doorpost until his ribs went in like basket work. The living knew the signs, and their remedies were practical. The eyes of a dead man were closed before the body cooled, and nobody walked in front of a corpse while they were open. The dead were carried out feet first so that the head would not learn the way back. In some houses a hole was broken in the wall for the carrying and built up again behind. The everyday door was then one the dead man had never used. But some men had been too heavy-tempered in life for any of it to hold them. One was called Thorolf Twistfoot, for the leg he had dragged since his fighting years. He spent his last summer quarrelling over a strip of meadow he did not need. One evening he came in from that quarrel, sat down in his high seat, and refused his food. The household ate around him and went to their beds. In the morning he was sitting there still, upright against the boards, with his hands on the arms of the chair and his eyes open. Nobody would cross the floor in front of him. His son was sent for, and came in along the wall behind the chair, out of the line of the dead man's sight. He put his hands on his father's shoulders and held the body still. Then he reached round and shut the eyes with his fingers, and only then let the household come nearer. The wall behind the high seat was broken open. The corpse was drawn out backwards through the gap, and the gap was closed the same day. Oxen were harnessed to the sledge that carried him up the valley. They went mad before they reached the cairn, tore loose from the traces, and ran until they fell. He did not stay in the cairn. Cattle grazing near it were found dead with their bones out of joint. Shepherds who crossed that ground after dusk were found black to the shoulders in the morning. The farms below emptied one household at a time. So the body was dug up and carried out to a headland where fewer people had reason to go. That held for some years, but the walking began again along the shore. They opened the ground a second time and found him undecayed, swollen and black, lying exactly as he had been laid. This time they burned him to ash on the stones, and the wind took the ash out over the water. The same coast held a farmstead called Froda, a low house of turf and timber within sound of the sea. What happened there began quietly in the ordinary week after a harvest. The fires were lit down the middle of the hall as they were lit every night. The household sat along the benches with their wool and their mending. Then the packed earth of the floor opened near the fire. A seal's head came up through it as though the floor had been still water, and it turned and it looked down the room at them. A servant took a club from beside the door and struck it. The head did not go down, it rose further up to the shoulders, and the flippers came clear of the floor. He struck again, and it rose again, and the wet of it shone in the firelight. The household sat where they were, and did not move. A young man took a sledgehammer off the wall, and beat the head down with slow, full blows. He drove it back into the floor as a stake was driven into soft ground. The earth closed over the last of it, and the floor lay flat. None of them could say afterwards why they had all stayed sitting. Before the month was out, the shepherd of that farm was found dead in the home field, with no wound on him. He was buried properly, and he came home that same week. He was heard on the roof after dark. A man who met him in the yard was carried in at dawn with the print of 2 hands on his neck. Then the master of the house took a boat out with a crew of 11, and the sea kept every one of them. The ale was brewed for their funeral feast, as it would have been brewed for anyone. On the first evening of it, the door opened. The master of the house came in with his 11 men behind him, and every one of them was soaked to the skin. They walked the length of the hall without looking at anybody, and sat down at the fire in a row. They wrung the sea-water out of their sleeves and their hems onto the hearthstones, where it hissed and steamed. They dried their clothes and their hair at the heat, and they said nothing at all. The living sat at the far end and let them do it. Before morning, the drowned men went out again. They came back the following night, and the night after, and every night that winter. In time the shepherd came with them. Then others of the household sickened and died, and were at the fire too. On some evenings there were more dead men drying themselves in that hall than there were living people lying awake behind the panelling. The living took to sitting at the upper end with a lamp burning. They carded and spun and mended in the same room. They got used to it, in the way that people would get used to nearly anything that happened every single night. What ended it was a lawsuit. The son of the house rode out to a man who knew the law, and was told to hold a court at the door and to try the dead by the procedure that would be used against any living trespasser. So a fire was carried round the hall and hallowed. A bench was set at the threshold, and men were named to sit on the case in the proper number. Each dead man was summoned by his own name. in the form the law required, for going about the house without leave and for depriving the household of health and of life. The evidence was given, the judgment was spoken, each one was sentenced out of the doors and off that land, and there was no anger anywhere in the room while it was done. Then they went. The shepherd rose from his place first and walked to the threshold, and he said, I sat here as long as I was let. The drowned men stood up one after another and passed out into the yard. The master of the house went last. Then he stopped in the doorway and looked back at the fire he had sat beside every night since the sea took him. Then he said, There is no peace to be had here now, and so we shall all of us go elsewhere. The door was shut behind him, and the bar was dropped, and nothing came to that fire again. But not all of them were ended so evenly. In a northern valley there was a herdsman called Glam, a big ill-tempered man from over the sea. He refused his fast on Yule Eve, ate his meat, and went out to the sheep in bad weather. He was found on the ridge the next day, swollen and blue-black, with the ground torn up all round him. After that he rode the roofs at night until the rafters cracked and the farm was abandoned. Grettir came at last and took hold of him in the broken hall. They went down together in the doorway as the moon came out. Glam turned his eyes up into Grettir's face and said, You shall be an outlaw. Your strength shall grow no further, and my eyes shall be before yours in every dark place you would ever stand in. Grettir cut his head off and burned him, but he was never afterwards able to be alone at night, and he knew from that hour that he would die badly. None of these had gone down. Hel had been given the lodging and the board of everyone who was sent to her. Nobody had sent these, and so they had never been her business at all. They were left standing on the surface, in the byres and the fields and the doorways of the people who had buried them. Every remedy the living had was a remedy of walls and fire and law. In the valleys the farms lit their lamps early. Inside one of them a bar was dropped into its brackets across a door of grey timber, with the frost already stiffening on the outside of the boards. That door would hold through that winter, and through a great many winters after it, until the sea rose high enough that no door anywhere would hold anything at all. Part 13, Naglfar. The door held through that winter, and through the winters of that man's sons. The farms went on lighting their lamps early. Then a winter came that did not give way to a spring. The snow lay on into the time of sowing, and the seed that would have gone into the ground stayed in the sacks. A second winter followed the first, with no summer laid between them. A third followed the second. Men counted them at first and then stopped counting, and afterwards the thing would be called the Fimble Winter, which meant the mighty winter. Before the snow there had been something worse, and it had come on so gradually that few had marked the beginning of it. The oaths went first. Men swore and did not keep their word, and the keeping of a sworn word stopped being the measure of anyone. Brothers fought brothers and killed each other for gain. Sisters, sons, broke the kinship that lay between them. It was an axe age and a sword age, with the shields cloven through. It was a wind age and a wolf age, and no man in it would spare another. Fathers went unavenged, and sons went unmourned, and the dead were left where they lay for whoever came along the road after them. The world had been coming apart at the joints for a long while before the weather ever turned. Then the weather turned. The snow drove in from every quarter at once, from the north and the south and the east and the west. A man crossing his own yard could not tell which way the wind had him. The frost went deeper than frost had ever gone. The rivers stopped in their beds. The fjords closed over, The sea took a lid of grey ice far out beyond any water that had ever frozen before. Cattle stood in the stalls and died standing. The turf roofs carried so much snow that the rafters came down in the night on the people sleeping under them. Firewood ran out in the first of the 3 winters. The salt fish ran out in the second, and there would be no third catch. In the third there was nothing left in the storehouses, and the storehouse doors stood open because there was no longer any reason to bar them. The sun came up each morning and gave no warmth and very little light. Men went out at midday with torches and came back with nothing. The wolves came down off the high ground and walked about the houses in daylight, and nothing that walked out against them would drive them off. In the end a wolf ran the sun down and swallowed her whole, and another took the moon. The stars went out of the sky one after another, as though a hand were putting out lamps along a wall. After that the shaking began, the mountains came down into the valleys, the trees went over with their roots turned up into the air, and the sea cliffs walked. Every fetter and every binding in the 9 worlds gave way in the same hour, because chains had metal in them and the metal parted. But the first thing that anyone properly understood was not the cold, and it was not the shaking. It was a sound, and it came from 3 places at once. On the roof of Valhalla, a cock called Gullinkambi, which meant golden comb, stood up on the ridge and crowed the Einherjar out of their beds. Far under the ground, in the halls of the seated dead, a cock the colour of soot crowed for the guests at their benches. In the gallows wood a 3rd cock, dark red, whose name was Fjalar, crowed for the giants. The 3 of them called across 3 worlds in the same breath, and each of the 3 would be answered. Then Garm howled at Nipperhellir. He had been howling on that chain for longer than the halls above him had stood. The sound of it had been part of the road down for as long as there had been a road. But this time the chain came apart at the ring, and the howling moved. It went up out of the cave mouth and along the frost. The dead in Eljudnir heard it passing outside the wall. In the same hour the wolf that had cost a god his hand broke his own binding and stood up in the open air. Somewhere under the earth a woman had been holding a bowl over her husband's face for an age of the world. The shaking took the bowl out of her hands. The stone she had bound him to split along its length. Loki came up out of that place with the venom still on his face. A dead woman in a mound had said long before that nobody would ride the road down to HEL again until Loki was loose from his bonds. She had been right about it, and now he was loose. The sea rose, Jormungandr, who had lain around the world so long that his tail had been in his mouth for the whole of it, let go and turned toward the land. He came ashore, blowing venom over the water and over the air above it. The sea went up behind him and over the low fields. The flood took the farms and the halls and the barrows along the whole coast, and it kept rising after that. The flood lifted a ship. It had lain at its moorings in the shallows of the north for the whole age of the world, waiting for the water that would one day be deep enough to float it. Its name was Naglfar, which meant the nail ship, and it was built out of the fingernails and the toenails of dead men. Every plank in it had been given by the dead themselves. This was why the living had always pared the nails of a corpse before it was carried out, and why a household that neglected it was held to have done a real and countable harm. A dead man laid in the ground untrimmed added his own portion of timber to that hull. The ship grew by a plank here and a strake there, through all the centuries out of ordinary carelessness in ordinary houses. Every uncut nail brought the day nearer, and none of the people who added to it would ever see the ship. There had been no great wickedness in it anywhere. There had only been a great many people who had not thought that it mattered. Naglfar came off the mud and swung out into the current. Some said that Hrym stood at the helm of her, an old frost giant out of the east with his shield held before him and the frost giants at his back. Others told it differently, and said the hand on the steering oar was Loki's, and that he had the dead of HEL for a crew. Both tellings agreed about the crew. They came up out of the hall that had been built to hold them, along the road that had only ever run one way, and out through the gates. Those gates had been hung to open inward. Everything that had ever come to that house had come in through them, and nothing had ever gone back the other way. Not the oldest woman on the benches, and not the fair one in the high seat whom all the worlds but one had wept for, had passed out through them. But on that day the gates stood open outward. The dead walked through them in their thousands, down the frost to the water. They went aboard without any hurry at all, because they had no reason left to hurry and nowhere that they would ever go back to. The ships came in at a plain called Vigrid. It was 100 leagues broad and 100 leagues long, and it was flat, and there was room on it for everyone who would come. It came up from the south, and Surt meant the Black One. He carried a sword that burned brighter than the sun ever had. The bridge of the gods broke under the weight of the riders crossing it. Odin rode out at the head of the Einherjar in his gold helm, and he went straight at the wolf, and the wolf swallowed him. Vidar, who was Odin's son and who seldom spoke, came in on the wolf from the side. He set one foot into the lower jaw. The shoe on that foot had been made of the leather scraps cut from every shoe in the world. He took hold of the upper jaw with both hands and tore the mouth apart. Thor killed the serpent. He walked 9 steps away from the body and went down dead in the venom it had breathed over him. Freyr fell to Surt. Tyr and Garma killed each other. Loki and Heimdall killed each other. None of it took very long, and none of it surprised anybody who fought there, because all of it had been known for a very long time. Last of all, something came up from underneath. Nidhogg had been at the third root for longer than the plane above him had existed, and he left it, and he came up out of Nastrond into the light of the burning. He flew low over Vigrid with the corpses of the dead lying in his feathers, and he crossed the whole width of the field, and then he was gone from sight. Threw his fire out over the worlds after that. The halls burned, and the ash tree burned, and the mountains burned down into their roots. But the sea came up over the burning ground and put it out. The steam stood for a long while and thinned away. The water lay flat from one edge of the world to the other, with nothing on it and nothing under it, making any sound at all. The earth came up out of the sea a second time. It came up green. The water ran off it and left the grass standing. An eagle went along the face of a waterfall. It hunted fish, and there were fish in the water for it to hunt. The fields carried grain that nobody had sown. The frost went out of the ground, and the rivers ran downhill again. Some of them lived through it. They came together on a plain called Idavol, the field that made itself new. The high halls had stood there before the burning. They walked about in the long grass, looking at the ground. What they turned up were the gold gaming pieces the gods had played with in the first age of the world. They lay in the roots of the grass, unmarked by the fire. They sat down and set them out. Then Baldr came up out of HEL, and Hod came up beside him. The queen below had named one condition and had held to it exactly, without malice and without any bending at all. All things in the 9 worlds had not wept for him, and so she had kept what was hers. Her word ran out only when the worlds did. The brother who had thrown and the brother who had fallen came up the road together. They sat down in the grass among the others, and the talk turned to old things. The rest of it was carried a long way by people who had never seen any of it. It was cut in runes on standing stones at the edges of fields. The men who cut it wanted a dead brother, remembered longer than they themselves would be. It was written out on calf skin in Iceland by men who no longer believed a word of it, and who copied it carefully all the same. And it stayed in the ordinary week, it stayed in the day that belonged to Tyr, and the day of Odin, and the day of Thrug, and the day of Frigg. Those names were spoken by people who had long since stopped knowing whose they were, and who would go on saying them anyway. But under all of it, the road was still there. It ran downward, and it ran northward, and it went a very long way. It ran exactly as it had run before there was anybody on it. The frost lay along it as it had lain first of all before the fire ever came over the gap. The gate at the bottom of it stood. The hall behind the gate was cold, and the sleet came in along the roof of it, and the long table was set from end to end. At the head of that table the queen sat with her hands in her lap, and a place beside her was laid for whoever would come next, and it had never once been full, and the road never hurried any of them.